A quote by Fred Korematsu: "I did nothing wrong except follow my conscience." Just 2 months after the attack of Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt, who was Commander-in-Chief of the United States, issued Executive Order 9066, which resulted in the internment of Japanese Americans. The internment of Japanese Americans during World War II was a violation of basic human rights, driven by racism and emotions that came from the many wars that were going on. The internment of Japanese Americans during World War II highlights the several possibilities of giving away freedoms because the United States named it national security. Even today, cases of racial profiling and the ruining of civil liberties and human rights occur during national crisis. This shows how Japanese American internment represents a clash between civil rights and perceived national responsibilities during wartime. This event plays a crucial role in reminding the government not to have the same devastating event occur again. Rights, responsibilities, and the price of fear. The Japanese American internment of World War II. December 7, 1941, Japan had launched an attack on the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Approximately 3,500 innocent civilians and American troops were severely wounded or even killed after the attack. This attack was caused by Japan's thinking of Pearl Harbor being a trump card for the U.S. and an important strength, which will ultimately destroy or impair the military. Though the Japanese Americans that lived in the U.S. were innocent, Roosevelt's Executive Order 9066 sent about 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry to the internment of 10 separate camps that the War Relocation Authority controlled. These camps were located in the western interior of the U.S. Before the internment of the Japanese Americans, more than 400,000 of Japanese descent had immigrated to the U.S. for a better life and a better future for their families and children. However, the first generation of Japanese immigrants weren't credited for their hard work. They were discredited and had to live through inhuman circumstances and against white workers that had harsher working environments. Many issues began to arise as many native U.S. citizens felt threatened by the mere presence of the Japanese American ancestry. This led to them being perceived as dangerous, and their constitutional rights, such as the 15th and 14th Amendments, were suspended. This showed that the actions of others, such as the Japanese government, in this situation could affect the lives of the innocent who had no connection to the issue. Amid the Pearl Harbor attack in 1941, 120,000 Japanese descent inhabited the United States, many of which were full citizens, meaning that they were born and raised in the United States. Soon after the attack, many suspicions arose of the Japanese Americans. Many even called them spies for the Japanese government. Following the Pearl Harbor attack, there was much propaganda against the Japanese Americans. In 1942, an infamous propaganda cartoon was released by Dr. Seuss. The cartoon depicted that those of Japanese descent from all over the West Coast were preparing for the sabotage against the United States. This infamous cartoon instigated the public, fueling them with more fear of the Japanese Americans. This fear led the Roosevelt administration to set a policy that would affect the people of the Japanese descent greatly. Executive Order 9066 launched that all people of Japanese ancestry were sent to internment camps for almost the whole war. The government had stated that this decision was made because of national security, even though this decision had violated the rights of many Japanese citizens. However, there were many incidents where Japanese Americans weren't sent to internment camps. In turn, many Japanese descent men, or typically young boys, fought alongside American soldiers against Japan. For example, in 1943, 78,000 boys of Japanese descent had taken the loyalty questionnaire. This questionnaire decided if a person of Japanese descent would be sent to 2 Lakes internment camps to be segregated and fight alongside American soldiers. 12,000 of 78,000 boys refused, while the 66,000 agreed to the terms of not being segregated in 2 Lakes internment camps. Another incident was that of the non-internment of the Japanese in Hawaii. Many factors were concluding the decision, such as more than a third of 100,000 people were of the Japanese descent in Hawaii. If the people of Japanese descent were interned, the economy of Hawaii would have collapsed. One of the known people of Japanese descent who were in Hawaii at the time of the Pearl Harbor attack was Reynold T. Muraoka. Rinaldi Maranica was in Hawaii during the bombing of Pearl Harbor and then served throughout the war when even some of his families and friends were in the camps. In his memoir, it's stated that he trained alongside American soldiers to represent his loyalty to the United States. Though this decision could be seen as an act of surrendering to the United States, it also shows that he was trying to be a true citizen and had wanted to be loyal and protect the country that he was born and raised in. Several weeks before the Pearl Harbor attack and the Japanese Americans being sent to internment camps, Curtis B. Munson was assigned an intelligence gathering investigation regarding the loyalty and the threat of the Japanese Americans by the presidential envoy John Franklin Carter. Using research and discussion with Navy and agents from the Federal Bureau, the report concluded that the Japanese Americans had posed little to absolutely no threat. However, the decision and damage had already been done, meaning that big decisions affect large groups of people should not be taken lightly and should be taken with thorough consideration and research so many would not be harmed negatively. This decision could also highlight how racism played a major role because Japanese Americans were targeted multiple times for unfair treatment because of racial stereotypes. Even with evidence of the Japanese posing little threat, the U.S. government must have used racial stereotypes against the Japanese American. Although released, Japanese Americans faced severe mental health issues from internment. Despite the Munson report, which indicated that they posed no threat, they were still unjustly sent to internment camps from the day of February 19, 1942. This trauma led to mass suicides, with Mary Fleury comments stating, mental health issues were common because they were pride of everything, reflecting the government's unjust actions. Moving on, Japanese Americans adopted, organized, and preserved cultural practices during the time of the internment camps. Buddhists in the camps were able to preserve family and community ties using the arts and rituals to tribute their previous ancestors and keep their culture alive during the harsh times. Internees still believed and supported their culture as if seeking refuge within their culture. Though many were scared to speak up about the situation, Fred Korematsu did. Fred Korematsu was born in Oakland, California to Japanese immigrant parents. During World War II, he went against Executive Order 9066 and refused to go to internment camp, leading to his arrest. His case, Korematsu versus United States in 1944, went against the righteousness of internment, but the Supreme Court didn't agree. In 1983, the conviction was overturned or canceled. Soon after, Fred Korematsu became a key player in the history of civil rights activists, eventually being awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1998. Here you can see Fred Korematsu received the Presidential Award of Freedom in 1998, just 7 years before his ultimate death. Eventually, the Supreme Court has stated that this decision was constitutional. This battle harnessed the spirits of many Japanese Americans, leading them to protest, showing that one person can uplift many others. Eventually, during the presidential rule of Ronald Reagan in 1988, he signed the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. Eventually, during the presidential rule of Ronald Reagan in 1988, he signed the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. Eventually, during the presidential this law was made to enhance the point of the internment being unfair, and apologies were made. The attorneys and the people affected were given $20,000 each. Even though their compensated apologized, they were still greatly affected. We can reflect on this chapter and influence discussions about civil liberties during crisis. For example, after the terrorist attacks on September 11, 2001, interrogation techniques such as waterboarding, stress positions, and sleep deprivation were used on many detainees, even though this violated U.S. and international law. However, many positive things happened, such as strengthening legal protections and being against racial discrimination. The legacy of Japanese internment means the responsibility of a government to balance protecting rights and civil liberties. The Japanese American internment of World War II helped enhance the protection of civil liberties and evaluate policies more efficiently. And lastly, not be overwhelmed by fear and prejudice. Lastly, another quote by Fred Korematsu. If you have the feeling that something's wrong, don't be afraid to speak up. Fred Korematsu.